less crucial to make sure that we could include some of you, and so welcome. This is the first of our series on career paths in science outside of academia, and we're very fortunate today to have Dr. Nick Edwards with us. He has gone through the process that many of you are going through right now. He did his graduate degree at Brown University and got his Ph.D. in neuroscience, and then went through a very methodical process of finding a postdoc lab that included beach sports. So he ended up at UC San Diego with Jeffrey Isaacson, where he became a synaptic neurophysiologist, and published his papers there in PNAS and did really well for himself. And then following his postdoc is when he kind of branched out and went away from the route that I'm familiar with, my own experience moving into PI. He went and became a consultant with the Boston Consulting Group and did that for about a year. Before moving into a manager position, senior manager position at Illumina, which is located in La Jolla, for those of you that don't know. So it's a fantastic biotech company in La Jolla. He was there again for a little over like a year and a half. And then during that time, or I don't know, Nick, was it before that when you started the podcast, the Once a Scientist podcast?
It was during that time, yeah.
Yeah. So he's talked about his podcast, different aspects of consulting and careers in biotech. He has a series on, actually a short series on consulting in that podcast. So check it out, give it a listen. After Illumina, he became the director of and head of scientific culture at a startup called Resilience in San Diego. Eventually then moving into his last position, which was as a venture partner at Alloy Therapeutics, which he just wrapped up in July, I guess, maybe shortly around when I contacted you about this series. So really excited to hear about it. Welcome virtually to BNI and Weill Cornell. This is going to be the first of several of these style talks put on by our office up here at BNI. The next one is going to be Deanna Adkins from the NIH on January 20th, 2023. So people can put that in their notes. So welcome. And I'm going to ask that everyone stays muted, and you can leave your video off too, just for bandwidth issues. If anybody has questions, pop in and ask. You can also raise your hand. I'll be trying to monitor the participants list. So thanks.
All right, thank you, Edmund, and thank you all for having me. It's really an honor to be here. Please feel free to jump in at any time, ask questions. I want to make sure that this is helpful to people. I also realized that it's actually the 23rd, not the 22nd. So my apologies there. But Edmund, I really appreciate the introduction. As you can tell, and I'll show you in the next slide, kind of a little bit more about my career transitions. I've had some, pretty varied experiences after my postdoc, and through like doing some neuroscience after my PhD or after my postdoc, but really working across a lot of different fields. And the one thing I want to emphasize, though, is that this is my experience. I'm one person, and that's like one data point, right? I think it's really important that, and I'll emphasize this. I think I'll talk about it a little bit more, but treat each of these conversations like as data points that you're analyzing as you think about what the future path is for you, whether that's in academia or what we call industry, which is a pretty broad term. So just jumping in real quick. There we go. So this is my journey so far. I did neuroscience as an undergrad, neuroscience as a PhD, neuroscience as a postdoc. I really enjoy and am interested in neuroscience. It was during my PhD that I really started getting into synaptic physiology, and I worked on the reward circuits involved in addiction. I mean, the circuitry involved in addiction and reward, dopamine neurons, their inputs, and the ways that they're modulated by various neuromodulators. And I was doing a lot of this work in brain slices, and a bunch of in vivo optogenetic type of work. And I really loved it. Like, to be honest with you, I miss working in the lab, working with my hands, because to me, patch clamp electrophysiology is like, it's like a video game. You know, you get used to it and you get good at it, and you learn how to manipulate and solve, like ask questions, and it translates, you know, into in vivo behaviors, you know, a lot of times. And so I just kind of became super fascinated with that. I planned to become an academic the entire time throughout my PhD. There were definitely some periods where I had doubts that I was going to be able to. But I eventually went on to do a postdoc, and you know, we can talk about the decision-making process that went into that. Like, I was just telling Edmund and a few people before this that I had this like crazy long spreadsheet that I had put together of like weighted average for like all of the PIs that had done interesting work that I'd seen in like Nature Neuroscience or Neuron for the last few years. I looked at all the articles, and then I wrote down all the PIs, and like I ranked and scaled things, and I put in like I had this vague idea that, well, if academia doesn't work out, then I should go somewhere where there's going to be other opportunities. And so I ranked. I also weighted it according to like, is there a biotech industry close to where these institutions are? In the end, I visited one of the PIs when I was on vacation, and he was like, "You want to come do a postdoc in my lab?" And he was, you know, just a great person, and so I joined his lab, and kind of threw all the numbers out the window. But it was during my postdoc where I was continuing to do electrophysiology, but this time it was like in awake animals, and I was enjoying it, but I had a family, and I decided that, you know, I just couldn't really afford it, like, and that I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to make it work in the long term. And that's when I started thinking about different options, and you know, I'd been kind of thinking about the biotech industry before that, but I started to really think, okay, where could I enter? And I didn't really know like what the possibilities were for like an electrophysiologist. So I figured maybe it wouldn't be from the technical side. And I got this vague idea that I could kind of still contribute to science and do exciting things, but just approach it from more of a business angle. And that's when I really kind of gunned it hard and applied, interviewed at tons of places, got rejected at tons of places, and was able to get into Boston Consulting Group, where I did strategy consulting. I can talk more about what that is if that's helpful for people. But you know, just maybe kind of going along the story arc, I wanted to come back to San Diego. I left to go to Dallas for BCG, and I really wanted to make it back to San Diego. And that's when I joined Illumina in their corporate strategy team. And so, you know, the point of this slide is that, like, at least for me, things don't always go as planned. And you kind of have to control, or I mean, you have to like be flexible and adaptable. But basically what I want to do here is like kind of give you an outline of the path that I've gone, but also give you a sense of some other things that other people have done, because my experience, like I said, is very anecdotal. And this is actually why I started a podcast, was because when I was working in industry at BCG, I started realizing like, I couldn't find a consolidated source for information about what scientists do. And when I was a PhD student, when I was a postdoc, and so I started to try and make that when I was working at Illumina. And that's when I started this podcast. I don't make any money from the podcast. And so, yeah, I see a hand raised.
Hey, Nick, yeah, I didn't want to interrupt too much, but you said you're cool with questions. So I think I would personally, and I know maybe some others would also be interested, but if you do want to elaborate a little bit about what it's like being a scientific consultant, I think it's a really intriguing career trajectory that a lot of people don't think about. I know at least kind of the dogma is, okay, you're either going to stay in academia or you're going to go industry like a pharmaceutical company or something like that, but you'd still do kind of bench related work versus as a consultant, you're kind of a whole different thing, right? Maybe.
Yeah, for sure.
You want to elaborate a little?
Yeah, absolutely. Consulting is interesting in that there's different kinds of consulting. There's life sciences or like more scientific consulting. BCG is a large strategy consulting firm, and so most of the time, what they're doing is they're working with like what you call Fortune 100 businesses, like some of the larger businesses in the world, and you're helping them to identify problems that they have in their organization and to solve those problems. That could be across any industry, and so as you'll see, as I'll mention in a couple of slides, like I didn't actually do any work in the life sciences or in sciences really in general. I did like work looking at semiconductors, like semiconductor strategy in China. That was one of the projects that I worked on at BCG. Another one was like trying to help like a Texas state government institution like rebuild its IT system. And so these are things that I didn't have expertise in, but these strategy consulting firms, what they're looking for are people that are really good at solving problems and that can do math pretty well, and just think critically, and that can communicate. And they find those people in business school, they find them in PhD programs, they find them in doctoral, like MD programs. Lawyers worked at BCG, and there's a few firms like this, like McKinsey, Bain, and that's one type of consulting. There's also firms that are focused specifically on helping pharma or life sciences, like biotech firms, and that's more life sciences consulting. They call that boutique consulting. I talk in pretty quite a bit more depth about this in a series that I have on the podcast, and I'm again like I'm happy if people listen to it if it helps, but I'm not making money off this, so like I'm just I promote it so that people are aware of resources. But there's a series on the website. It's onceascientist.net, and there's a consulting 101 tab. And there's a 5-part series on like what consulting is, how to get into consulting, like how to do case interviews, how to do behavioral interviews, and it's a series I did with a couple of universities, and so feel free to check that out if you're interested in consulting, and also like reach out to me more. I'm happy to talk more about it. Is that helpful?
Awesome. Yeah. No. Thanks so much. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. No. I don't. No apologies. Any other questions before I move on? Okay, keep the show on the road. All right, so I just want to tell you all a few stories about some of the people that I've interviewed on the podcast, just because it's interesting. The different types of things that scientists do. So Chanel Matney, the one on the top, is just a really interesting person. She was a neuroscience PhD student at Johns Hopkins, and this was during the time of when Freddie Gray was murdered in Baltimore, and there were riots that were happening in the city, and she was a Black woman that realized like that she was surrounded by people that didn't look like her. And she wanted to make a change, a difference in making science accessible to people of different backgrounds. And so she started an organization where they went around, they taught to inner city high school students, I think it was, about science, and just generally about science, got them interested. This turned into a passion of hers, and she became a public policy consultant. She's done a few interesting things since, and now I think she works for the California Department of Transportation, working on policy. And so, you know, I think it illustrates an example of like, if sometimes you just get involved in something and you're passionate about it, like you start to gain expertise in that, even if you're not paid to do it. And those types of things can turn into careers. Ugo Tejeda was a postdoc in the lab that I worked in as a PhD student. He was a huge mentor to me and just a really great scientist. He grew up in on the border of El Paso, Texas, and Juarez, Mexico. He grew up in very difficult economic conditions, and he had no idea what it meant to be a scientist. Nobody that he'd ever known was a scientist. But when he started his undergrad, I think at University of Texas, El Paso, he met a PI that like took him under his wing and took him under her wing and mentored him, and he like got this bug for science, and like it just never gave up. Like there was no looking right or left for him. And one of the smartest, most determined people I've ever met in my life, and a huge inspiration to me. He did very well in his scientific training, and was very fortunate in a lot of ways as well, and went on to become an investigator at the National Institute on Mental Health. And he's incredibly happy with his career. The third person, Ashley Javanette, is a professor at UCSD, but she's a teaching professor. She did her PhD, I think, at UCSD, and maybe her postdoc at, I'm sorry, I haven't looked at their backgrounds recently, but I think it was at Cold Spring Harbor. And she just really liked like communicating. And I think that she started to like get involved with Twitter and built up a following there. I could be wrong about that, but basically she had neuroscience chops, and like she was a really strong. She knew a lot about physiology and data science, and UCSD hired her as faculty, tenure track faculty actually, in teaching. And her story, I think, is really cool. The last one that's on there, his name is Ahmed Servastava, and this is actually one of the more interesting stories on the podcast from my perspective. I interviewed him at the very beginning. He grew up in rural India, and he had seen like the devastating effects of infectious disease on people, people dying around him, like growing up, and this became a passion for him, like his life mission. And he went to graduate school. He went to BCG. He went and started a couple companies, and he came back to Pfizer. And he was like, he was set on making an impact on infectious disease. And when I talked to him, actually, it was like right before COVID had really kind of blown up. And then I had to do a follow-up episode with him, because he was helping to lead their mRNA therapeutic development. So this guy to me is a hero. He helped commercialize the COVID-19 vaccines, and went after something that was kind of a different career path. There, not a lot of people were super focused on infectious disease before COVID happened, as you all probably know. So this is just to give you a few examples of the types of things that people do. Like we say academia and we say industry, and there's like so many facets of each of those things. And it's just really important to kind of start to get a lay of the landscape of what's really out there, because it may be much more expansive than you think at first glance. So before I move on, I'll pause.
Okay, any questions for Dr. Edwards at this point? What's great, actually, I know Ashley Javanette as well. She was a graduate student at UCSD before doing her postdoc at Cold Spring Harbor, and I've run into her both places. So I know she wrote a book recently on like you want to be a neuroscientist, right?
It's a great book. Yeah, I have it. Yeah. So she talks about how to succeed in a career in neuroscience, and she also talks about like what are the different options out there. So yeah, that's a great resource.
Thanks.
Great. All right, I'm going to move on and give you a little bit more of the reality here. You see all these things, and maybe it looks like, okay, it's like I don't think of it this way, but maybe it looks like a feather in the cap for each of these things, right? You graduate to different stages, but like the reality is often much more complex. In my undergraduate degree, I did not plan on becoming a neuroscientist at all. I didn't even know about neuroscience as a field. I was actually an English literature major, and I pursued that up until my senior year when I did a law internship, and I was like, oh wait, I don't know what I'm going to do here. And I took some chemistry classes, got like super interested in organic chemistry, and then I figured out, oh wait, like science is actually pretty cool. It's pretty interesting. So I changed my major my senior year. It was crazy hard. It was like, kind of a, I don't know. In retrospect, it could have been very much more concise and fast, but like this is the reality of how things kind of pan out. In my Ph.D., this joint program between Brown and NIH, I really like severely failed for 3 years from my perspective, like at least from my perspective at the time. I learned a lot of lessons, but I had to switch my entire dissertation 3 years in, and it was pretty disheartening. And I thought about leaving academia at that time because like I didn't have any publications, but I was fortunate that like I had some mentors like Hugo Tejeda in the last slide. He helped me learn physiology and helped me think very rigorously, and then I was able to finish pretty quickly after that. But it wasn't easy. I was working in downtown Baltimore, and I had one kid at the time when I started graduate school, and then 2 by the time I finished. We literally lived on food stamps. It was challenging, but we were able to make it work at the time. But I still wanted to continue on in academia as a postdoc. That's when I kind of realized that I wasn't going to be able to do that in California, just from a financial perspective, personally. And so that's when I switched to BCG. And it sounds great. It sounds like a really awesome experience. It was a really great experience at BCG, but the reality was that like I wanted to be working in the life sciences. I wanted to be in California and in San Diego, and I was working in Dallas, and I was working mostly in the tech industry. And so like, I'm kind of like refining my hypothesis and pivoting as life circumstances come up, right? And so I had this opportunity to go to Illumina, and again, really great place to work. All of these places, like I had such great experiences, mentors, some challenges definitely, but Illumina hit and I was really enjoying the company. And the pandemic hit and like everyone's working from home. I don't know what's going on. And all of a sudden one day, I like a few months into the pandemic, I broke my neck when I was surfing. And that was like a wake up call to me. It took 4 months for me to recover. And some new opportunities had come up. And I think, you know, part of it was the podcast, to be honest with you. Because I had started to build up a network of different people. And this is when these startup experiences really started popping up. What I ended up deciding to do was to go work for a company that had this massive amount of funding. It was like kind of unprecedented venture capital funding in the biotech industry at Resilience, and really interesting experience, like across Resilience, across Alloy Therapeutics, where at Alloy I was helping build companies, one of which was a company focused on neurodegeneration, and so these are like very early stage startups, and you know you're doing 15 different jobs, not all of them incredibly well. But you're just trying to keep the balls in the air. But you know, the reality is that I spent, what is this, like several years in my undergrad, probably five and a half years in my undergrad, 4.5 in my PhD, a couple of years, so like maybe 12 years across academia. And you know, I started BCG about almost 5 years ago. So I've been at 4 different places in the last 5 years, and you know, that comes with its own excitement and its own challenges. And so you know, that's part of it is because I'm still trying to figure out what is like the ideal thing for me in my future, and that's like something that you know, that's part of it's my personality. Like I like to keep options open and assess various things. But another part is kind of opportunistic, and maybe in the next slide, what I'd like to do is just kind of point out a few of the lessons that I've learned across this. But before I do so, happy to pause if there's any questions, comments. I know it's a little chaotic here.
So any follow-up for Dr. Edwards at this point?
I have a quick question, if that's okay, at this
Yeah,
point.
of course.
Yeah.
So you can't see me. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. I think there's a lot of similarities, at least from my personal experience up until this point, from what I went through, and it's really good to know that I'm not the only one. I wanted to ask a little bit more about when you mentioned that you realized academia was not for you for your own reasons. I was wondering if you, what was the process you went through up until the moment you realized you wanted a consulting position, or you interviewed for one? Because I kind of feel like I wish there was this menu of options, and you kind of talked about it briefly. I have no idea what's out there. I know what my skills are, but yeah, I'd love to hear from your experience. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for asking. So it was a difficult decision, but like to be honest with you, the clock was ticking, and like we were going into debt as a postdoc, and we were, you know, like struggling to make ends meet, and I started thinking like, okay, well, I have to do something. and so I lived about a 7 or 8 minute walk from, we found this amazing deal. We lived 7 or 8 blocks from campus, from the lab that I was in at the Center for Neural Circuits and Behavior. And I could walk to the lab, but I could also like get to my favorite surfing break within like a few minutes. And so I would try and surf like at least a couple, 2-3 days a week. I would do that, very early in the morning before I went into the lab. And I had a friend that I would go surfing with, and I had started to think like, okay, what am I going to do? Like, I feel like I'm like really backed into a corner. And we were walking down surfing one day, and he was like, well, have you ever thought about consulting? I was like, I mean, I know about it. I've heard about it, but he's like, well, people are looking for, they hire a lot of PhDs. And I was like, oh, okay, well, let me look into it. And I went to UCSD has this great consulting club called, they have a consulting club for students and postdocs. And I went to this event, and it was like, it was basically this life sciences consulting firm came, and they gave a problem, they gave a competition. You joined a team and you solved a problem over the course of a few weeks. And I tried that, and I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like, you can actually, you're still kind of using the scientific method to solve problems. And there's just different types of problems. And I liked the problem solving aspect of it. And so I started doing more and more research into it. And eventually it got to a point where I was like, okay, I'm going to go for this, and I'm going to try. And I knew it was a long shot to get in. But with that, I had to confront my PI and be like, I don't know that this is gonna, like, I need to figure out something else. And like, to his credit, he was like so supportive of me. I was very fortunate in this regard. And I continued to work in the lab. I still put in, like, did all daily experiments, and but like at nighttime, or like I didn't put as many hours into the lab. I was working maybe 8 to 9 hours a day in the lab, and then I would go and meet with all these people and practice to get into consulting. I must have practiced like I don't know, 70 hours across the course of 2 months maybe. And I interviewed with lots of companies, got rejected by several companies, and then got into BCG. And so it was fast. It was a fast transition. And honestly, I didn't know like what else was out there, because I just didn't have time to like look around and see what other options were there. But it ended up being a pretty cool opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thanks for asking. Thanks for jumping in. Anybody else? Okay. Okay. So, I mean, this slide, just to kind of like summarize some things that I've learned, sometimes the hard way. It's important to like be proactive and really dig deep, think introspectively. And when I say use a telescope, not just a microscope, many of us are reductionist biologists, and we like to look at very detailed things. And that goes for the experimental type of work that you're doing sometimes, and it also goes for how you approach life. And this is one thing I learned when I was at BCG. It's really important to be able to zoom out, way out, and zoom way in. You know, it's like you're using that objective on a microscope, because you have to be able to figure out what's the landscape. If I'm doing slice electrophysiology, I need to know, and I'm patching from VTA dopamine neurons, I need to know that I'm in the VTA first. And so I'm zooming out to look at this brain slice. And then I'm zooming in because I know what the morphology of the dopamine neurons looks like. So I change the objective, and I find those neurons, and then I can do the physiology on them. I don't know if that example resonates with everyone, but my point essentially is like, get a view of the landscape, like try and understand all the different things out there. Not all of them, but like at least start to make some hypotheses, and you're always trying to like go back and forth from like understanding at a high level what things are, and then get a little bit more granular and start doing some research behind each of these fields to see like, is this something that seems like it would be interesting to me. At the same time, like you need to be driving to figure out what you actually want. What are your priorities? Is it like, are your priorities to research something that you're super passionate about through your career, or do you have some other priorities? Like, in my case, it was family, it was location. I still wanted to do interesting, impactful things and work with science, but I knew that that I couldn't sacrifice everything to do what I wanted to do. So that's one point, is make sure that you're actually like, thinking about your own, like that you're being very proactive about like understanding yourself. The second thing is, we always talk about serendipity in science and these like amazing discoveries. I don't know, a good example, or maybe it's Watson and Crick with the helix, and obviously Rosalind Franklin, but these things, that seem to happen, that like change everything, that you didn't expect to come up, for example, in your life. They're in some ways they're chance, absolutely, and I have been very, very fortunate, but like I have worked like hell to make those chances possible, and one way to do that is through like the dirty word of networking. Talk to people that that are doing different types of things, and find out like what's interesting to them. Have genuine conversations. You don't have to be like an extrovert and walking up to a bunch of people at a party, because that's really not me. I do like having one-on-one conversations with people though, and so I utilize that to kind of gather data and learn about what's out there, and then use that data to start testing hypotheses. Like, okay, I think consulting sounds pretty interesting. I'm going to talk to, I don't know, in my case, I talked to like 30 people or something like that before I even got into a consulting firm. Maybe you don't have to be as intense as I am about some of these things. Like it's probably better to do it over time if possible, but it really just depends on circumstances and of your life at the time. Okay, control what you can, but be flexible. Like there's just so many things that in life right now that are happening in the world that or I don't it's yeah, what do you even say about it? The economy, the geopolitical environment, the market for finding jobs. Look, like I'm a job seeker myself right now. I know that it's challenging out there, but at some point you have to realize like there are things that I can control and there are things that I can't, and I'm going to do the best that I can to steer things in the right direction. And then it's about learning to make decisions dynamically. Like I saw a question in the chat. I'll get to it in a second. You need to. It's about learning to make decisions dynamically. Like as information is coming in and things are changing. Like being flexible and able to pivot at different points, and not just like putting your head down and forcing something through if you don't see it like happening in the long run. I was talking. Edmund made really like we were talking about this earlier, and he was like, he went kind of full force into academia. And I think that there's like absolutely something to be said. And it's really important to like put your head down and actually do science and get really good at what you're doing, because like that teaches you to be a critical thinker. And that teaches you like so many things that you will not learn out of science. So like continue to be a rigorous scientist, but gather information, be willing to make those changes if you have to, depending on your situation. And then the last thing is like the value that you bring. I mean, when you're around super smart people every day that are thinking have very cool, high-minded thoughts, it's easy to kind of, at least it was for me, to devalue yourself and to say, I don't fit in here, or like, maybe thinking that you're, I remember like thinking my PhD, I was like, I feel like the dumbest person in the world. And, that's clearly not true. But it's hard to get out of that way of thinking sometimes. But like realize that I guarantee you that with the position that you're in right now, you are intelligent, you're smart, you can make good choice. Like you can make doors open for you. You just have to figure out and start to learn like what your strengths are, and really kind of capitalize on those strengths. But I know like maybe by the time you're a postdoc, and so this is my case a little bit, like I felt competent enough to like feel like I was a good enough scientist, but like there's always a little bit of that imposter syndrome that you've got to let that, and sometimes you've got to push that away, and in other cases you've got to embrace it, and you've got to say, okay, like I don't know a lot about this thing, and I need to learn about it. And so sometimes that can drive you. The last thing I'll say about that, understanding your value, is like you've had so many worthwhile experiences that you just don't even realize sometimes. And this is where like introspection and like thinking about all the projects you've worked on, whether you like mentored people, whether like you did some sort of like project management because you're able to coordinate like things across large timescales, smaller timescales, to get a paper put out, to like work with collaborators. There are things that are needed in the business world, or like in other careers, that you provide value with. You just don't know about it yet, and so you need to learn like what those things are, and then how your experiences kind of map onto those things, and really kind of point that out in your resume and your applications. So we can stop there. I saw a question in the chat. Are there any online resources? Give us a thought process involving consulting for life sciences. That's a great question. There's none that I can think of off the top of my head, because I didn't do life sciences consulting personally, and I really pushed for kind of the general consulting. But I can say that I have interviewed a few people on the podcast that did life sciences consulting. One of them being LeBaron Agostini. I don't know which episode it is, but we talked about it. His experience doing that. Carlos Loya was another person that did life sciences consulting. I would say online resources. Yeah, I don't have any great online resources other than, there's probably some on Google. So with that, I'll open it up. Feel free, barrage me with questions, or I can just, ramble on.
Yeah, Nick, I'll chime in again and then let others as they go, and maybe we can talk about it later too. But one thing I was intrigued with, you touched on the consulting stuff, and other people have asked about that, but also I don't know a lot of people that have personally already been with like 4 different startups. How have each of those kind of, or within the last, year or two, like within such a short time frame, how has that been as far as not only just transitioning between the companies, but the roles of the companies? You said you're kind of doing like the job of like 15 different people, especially with a startup kind of dynamic where there's a lot going on. What's that been like? And maybe, I don't know, if you could elaborate a little bit, like if lab skills have helped in that aspect. I don't know. I'm just hypothesizing here.
Yeah, for sure. It's been so startups have been really the last couple years, and I think this goes for most startups. There's like a little bit of controlled chaos in all startups, and when I say a little bit, like sometimes more than a little bit. And you're trying to rein in that chaos and put structure around it and build something for the future that is going to last. And it's very ambiguous. It is pretty arduous in the sense that, or like it's exciting. And you really get to kind of dig in and learn a lot about a lot of different things, but you always feel like you're racing against the clock, because you are racing against the clock, because money runs out, and people have to get venture capital financing to keep these things going up, or like you're trying to help a company go public, for example. There's a lot of wearing of multiple hats, and then you start to kind of like gain a specialty. And in my case, actually, it's been my expertise has been pretty broad because I've done so many different types of things. But I don't know if I'm getting to the heart of your question.
No, I think this is insightful. I just kind of can't relate to that. You know what I mean? So it's cool to understand what that would be like, or in the context of what we're used to, like in academia. It's very much, I mean, they're learning new techniques sometimes, or you're joining a different field or joining a different lab, but you're not really ever wearing 15 hats. You're kind of, you're doing your bench work, or you're doing whatever it may be.
Yeah, you are doing more things than you may think, right? But like, there's a certain or there's a certain like predilection, is that the right word, for like risk. I, for better or worse, like I tend to be less risk averse than other people, and or more risky is another way to say it. And that comes with exciting things, and it also comes with kind of unpredictable an unpredictable aspect of it. So I think that I don't know, that's been my experience. I saw Anna raising her hand.
Hi, we are on a room with a lot of people here, so Hi,
I had a question. I'm Ayushma. I'm a research technician at one of the labs here. I was curious about your transition period from your postdoc to the consulting. Did you ever, so because like before that, when you had your transition from your PhD to postdocing, you kind of were already thinking about going to, not doing a postdoc and going into industry, let's say for now. So did you have a similar thing of like from your postdoc to consulting? Did you like want to stay in academia, like traditional academia, let's say like teaching, or continuing your postdoc?
My plan was to become a tenure track PI doing research at like an R1 institution. I started out my PhD thinking I was going to do teaching. That's kind of what I was excited about. And as it happens with a lot of scientists, I think you start researching and you get more excited about the research, or it seems to become like the kind of default path in some ways. But I definitely was planning on that path. and yeah, it was pretty. I tried to like really focus on getting toward that and driving toward that goal, but like the other like possibilities of going into biotech, those were really just like kind of contingency plans in case I didn't make it in academia. Was it? Yeah.
Can I maybe
Yes.
also ask a question? I'm a bit further away from the microscope, so I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Further away from the microscope. But, I was wondering what attracted you to the bio startup companies. That was there like did you specifically choose that, or was that an opportunity that came up for you?
It was both. I was actually starting up a company of my own at the time when I got recruited for resilience, and it just, you know, it ended up being it was something that I had been interested in, and I really the driving factor for going to work with startups for me was really feeling like I was making a direct impact, and building something that could benefit people. Like, you know, maybe there's a little bit of hubris in there as well, and thinking that you know, I was able to do that, and so yeah, I think that it was a bit opportunistic, and also I had been kind of like definitely thinking about those things for years. You know, even as a Ph.D. student, I like to build things. Like I would make like little contraptions to make my experiments go faster, and I just like the idea of like creating a thing, and so that had kind of always been bubbling up under the surface. I always thought like, oh, it'd be cool to start up a company, but I didn't know if that was ever going to be possible.
Yeah, I had a question. Could you talk more about your kind of the process of getting into the strategy consulting? Like you said, you practiced case interviews for 70 hours, and then you interviewed at a lot of different companies and finally settled at BCG. Can you talk more about that process? And I was kind of curious why, with all the life sciences background that you had, that you kind of went in the direction of just kind of pure consulting and not with a life science specialty.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's because I was curious. I wanted to figure out if this worked. Like, and I figured it would be interesting to see it across industries. And I wanted to settle down into life sciences eventually, but and biotech. But you know, it was almost purely curiosity driven. And the process was pretty intense. I met up with a consulting club. I found resources and people that wanted to practice case interviews. So you do these like 45-minute interviews, and you kind of grill each other. Like you give a problem, and then you have to solve a problem like with using numbers. And doing all the math behind, you know, some calculation in front of somebody, and that's what a case interview is. Like you have to succeed. You have to do this, like these 45-minute interviews at least a few times to get into a consulting firm, and so people practice, and it can be fairly intense. If you're like truly going to go after consulting, if that's something that you want to do, like I highly recommend like finding other people that are going to do it, and like committing hard and pushing hard for it, because they are fairly competitive positions to get into. There's like 6. If you're really interested in consulting, definitely visit my website. It's like onescientist.net, and then there's a consulting 101 tab. I built like 6 hours worth of material with Harvard and MIT consulting clubs to go into detail on like how to get in. I think it's still, it's still useful. It was a couple of years ago, but it's pretty timeless, I think.
All right, we're coming up on the hour here, so I wanted to thank Dr. Edwards for joining us today, and for everyone that's come to this session and participated. So we've recorded this. We'll be making it available through my office here at BNI, and then if Dr. Edwards would like it, maybe he'll host it as well.